Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the JottCast, where we talk about, actually, what are we talking about, Matthew? Any ideas?
Yeah, that's right. It's me, Matt. The second.
Matthew?
Well, yeah. Everybody calls me Matt, and that's why we're called Jott, because it's just the last 2 T's in Matt. But Josh here calls me Matthew because we've been best friends forever. But what are we talking about? Actually, to start off with this podcast, we thought we would just bring everybody into the fold of an inside joke between the two of us pertaining to the first podcast. So if you didn't listen to it, then go back and listen to the first 5 minutes of the first podcast. You don't need to hear the whole thing to be caught up with this. But Josh and I here were going back and forth about what kind of podcast we want this to be. What kind of topics do we want to talk about? And one of the first ideas that was brought up and immediately taken down was this being a video game podcast. Just because video games were a huge hobby for both of us back in the day, but let's just say in the last 5 to 10 years, we have not really had much to do with them whatsoever. So there's no point in us talking about video games constantly in this podcast, right? Now, with that said, Josh,
Yeah.
what was the very first thing that you, after immediately saying you didn't want to do a video game podcast, what was the very first thing you said to me in the last episode?
All right, look, I didn't want to discuss, you talked about E3. I didn't want to discuss E3 because I've literally never watched E3. I think maybe a little bit in the past. All right, and yes, it's possible that in the first podcast I mentioned Breath of the Wild 2 in the first 5 minutes. And it might be possible that I came to this podcast with the literal Nintendo Direct E3 video on my computer as we're talking. It's possible. But look, I had a reason for it, and I wasn't going to, but whatever, man. No one's perfect, so...
No one's perfect. So we're going to talk about Breath of the Wild 2 from E3.
But see, that's the thing. That's not the thing that actually got me the most. That's not the game. I don't even play these games. I play Breath of the Wild. I play it. I've been playing a lot of Mario 64 with my kids. Emma, my daughter, is really good at it for some reason. She can actually play better than Taylor can, my wife. So, which is interesting.
She's got those lightning fast reflexes.
Yeah, she's great, man. She plays a lot better than my wife does. But anyway, so I haven't played any games. But then after going through looking at E3, I didn't watch the whole video. I just watched the things that were pertinent. Breath of the Wild 2, interesting. You know, they'll probably just rehash the first one, probably, maybe some extras, whatever. But then I saw the Metroid game. That's really what got me thinking. And that's really what, I guess what kind of got me excited. And so I apologize for literally not wanting to do the thing you wanted to do. And then when you had it in mind not to do it, I mentioned it anyway and started talking about it. So whatever.
And then right before we go live today, you're like, so you want to start off talking about E3?
Yeah, I did it. Whatever, man.
But you know what? I don't blame you, because one of the things that you and I, well, for you it's a passion. For me, and for a lot of people, stories is something that almost is something that gets you out of bed in the morning, because maybe there's a book you're reading or a TV show you're watching or binging nowadays, and you want to know the end, right? But there's things that's happening throughout the story that's hooking you, sinking you in deeper, making you need to know the ending. And I think what you just said about how, like, you and I, we've always been Zelda fans. But the Breath of the Wild trailer 2 was okay. But I agree, it was not something that made me think, oh my God, I need to buy this so that I can play it for 3 hours and stop. What made me feel that way, actually, was what you just said, the Metroid trailer. Like, that is how you set up a trailer for even a movie, you know? Any story. Like, you start off with this character that we know decently well, who has a huge arsenal of amazing weapons, but none of them can even scratch this machine thing. This not even just a machine thing, but a machine horror. And no matter where you go, it will chase you and seemingly murder you in cold blood.
And,
I mean,
that's
that
not even
was
the first time that's
really crazy.
That's not even the first time in the series. You played Metroid Fusion, right?
I did thanks to you, right? You mailed me your
Wait.
cartridge.
Yeah, dude, I sent you my cartridge and you, no, let's see, we swapped because I think I sent you Zero Mission. Metroid Zero Mission. And then when you sent, you were going to, or maybe I sent you Fusion. I sent you one of those.
You sent me both.
You sent the cartridge wrong. You sent the wrong cartridge back. I have 2 copies of Metroid Fusion or one of those. I have like 2 copies of one of those.
Well, shit, I didn't know that.
Yeah, like I looked, I mean, I don't care. I don't play them anyway. But, I mean, I beat them. But Metroid Fusion, the same thing. If no one's ever played it, it's literally halfway through the game, you're getting attacked by this, like, super bot that's basically Samus except with all the weapons, and you can't beat it.
Yeah, dude, you're right. And, yeah, I probably played Fusion at this point probably 5 or 6 years ago, and even then it was an old game. And I remember feeling the terror. Like, it suddenly went from a side-scrolling shooter game to a horror game. Like, I was legitimately afraid. And I feel like, and that's something that I'm not really into, I just want to preface by saying I'm not really into horror stuff. I don't watch scary movies. I don't like scary video games on premise. But this was done, like, Fusion was done differently. And it made me hooked into it. And I get a very similar vibe from Metroid Dread that, like, it will be scary, but I need to play it. Especially
I guess
if it's short like Fusion. That's something that I actually want nowadays as an older person. I like to have a short game because that way I know I'm actually going to finish it.
Yeah, but, wasn't Dread, didn't they were going to release that game years ago as like a 2D Metroid like platformer, and they didn't?
Yeah, that was the rumor. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know any of the details around that either, but yeah, I think that was a rumor that Metroid Dread was going to come, and then like this game comes out like 20 years later or whatever with that title. That's wild.
Yeah. So I don't know. It looked pretty cool. I mean, I'm probably not going to play it right now. I think the last game we bought, my wife bought, was the Luigi's Mansion 3. And I'm basically borrowing Breath of the Wild, so I'm probably not going to spend any money. I might get one later on, but I'm not really planning on getting a lot. I just like seeing where they're going. But it did look pretty good. I guess it's in the name Dread. I mean, you're supposed to feel like you're being chased around this,
just
super
general
advanced robot.
Yeah, exactly. Not even that, but like the way it moves around, it's like one of those eldritch horrors,
Yeah, speaking of stories, have you read anything recently you want to talk about?
Well, yeah. Let's dive into books then.
I mean, I'm not really I think we both read. I don't know how much you've read recently. I know you read one book.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to bring up. I mean, I could say it, but I want to make sure I'm going to say it correctly because 2/3 of the words are in Japanese. Well, some guys, it's a Japanese name. Anyway, part of the problem, first world problems, right, is that whenever I read a book now, it's never a physical book. It's always on my library app, so I never see the cover of the book ever. It's just automatically on the page I left it on. So names of books don't get ingrained into my brain like they used to. But so the latest book I read was a book by Haruki Marakami, and it was called Colorless Tsukuru something.
Hold on, I have it right here.
It was just the guy's just got the guy's full name. Sakura something.
It's colorless Sakura Tozaki and His Years of Pilgrimage.
Yeah, there we go.
By Haruki Murakami.
There we go. That's it. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah,
so it was a pretty big book, but ultimately I read it in just one weekend because I couldn't put it down. It was written really well. Kind of the writing style was kind of where there's a lot of details coming in, not just about the surroundings, but also how the main character is feeling. And the author was able to mix those two feelings together really well, like consistently throughout the entire book. One thing that I thought was funny, though, about the writing style is, well, first of all, it's not, I mean, you probably already could tell, but the author is Japanese. So
yes.
All of his books, he writes in Japanese and somebody translates them into English. Well, there were on occasion whenever I felt like what he was saying would be probably what would be said in like an anime or something like that.
Because, probably, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, so it kind of opened my brain a little bit to be like, wow, animes aren't like being, they're not being overly emotional and like talking about like, wow, he's the best volleyball player ever.
Volleyball anime.
And then they go over like his schedule to make him be the best volleyball player ever, in one certain anime. I can't remember the name of it. But that's probably just like something in Japanese culture, which is something that my brain never really thought about before this book.
Well, we don't speak Japanese, so
right.
Yeah, actually,
it's probably
interesting fact.
A cultural and lingual thing together, right?
It might be. I know, like, if you ever look at what is it? Like those old kung fu movies. I love kung fu movies, but there's like kung fu movies, and it's like the names are ridiculous, like Flying Dragon Fists of Hellfire or something like that. It's just like a couple Chinese characters, and you're like, what the hell's going on here? And I think it's just the way it's translated. It might even be translated. Okay, so for example, there may be a way that it's said in Japanese that doesn't sound the same, I guess, that we perceive it in English. Like the same thing in Spanish. I mean, you speak Spanish. You and I actually both speak Spanish. So there are times where I'll be trying to translate something and it doesn't translate the same way. Like I'm trying to get it to sound like it would sound in English, but there's no way of really doing it without really thinking about it.
Right.
And there's a couple examples I'm not going to say.
Done.
Yeah, I'm not going to say. There's a couple of examples come straight to mind, but I'm not going to say them because they're pretty bad. But another interesting fact about this book I just found out is this is interesting. So
you're talking about colorless Sakura Tozaki? Okay.
So in Japanese there are 370 pages.
Yeah.
The English U.S. is 386. Okay, so more pages. Obviously, we know that you can cram more Japanese in a box than you can with English. Okay, but
totally.
So the U.S. is 386, but then right beside it says UK at 298. Is there a difference? That's like 100, almost 100 pages. There's almost 100-page difference in the U.S. and UK version.
You know what that makes me think of?
What?
Is that maybe books are formatted differently depending on the country, and maybe more words get put onto a page in the UK.
I don't know. I mean, maybe
even like the paper size is different.
Oh, that's not a bad example. I mean, that's like 100 pages, man. That's a lot. I mean, the only difference I can think of between that would be colorless would be spelled with a U, right?
Yeah, but it'd make it longer.
Yeah, I know. Hold on, let me look this up. Actually, this is an interesting fact. I didn't know this.
That's fascinating to me. I wonder if
Yeah,
that's the way with everything. Like every book is just shorter in the UK.
we're just bigger in America, Bo.
Oh, make it bigger here.
See, I don't know.
Well, there is actually another thing about the book being from Japanese is that I felt like there was a lot of times whenever things were just kind of being recapped, to the point where it was almost annoying. It was like on the verge of being annoying. Part of the book is like he's going around and revisiting his friends from high school. So he would go to see a friend, have a conversation. It lasts X many pages. And then after seeing that friend, he would think back on it. And that process of him thinking back on it would usually be pretty long too. And I'd be like, all right, I mean, yeah, I just read that whole conversation. I don't need to read it again necessarily. So my joke would be maybe in the UK they cut all that redundancy out.
They might. I don't know. I
No,
can't find.
there's no way.
I can't find anywhere that would explain the difference. If anyone knows, I mean, I don't know why the difference is almost. I mean, maybe the books are different size. Maybe because it's centimeters, not inches. I don't know. I have zero idea.
It's
That's
interesting
wild.
though, nonetheless.
Yeah. But no, that's great, man. Yeah, Carlos, I wanted to read it, but I couldn't find it. I'm not gonna. Currently not buying any new books because I have a stack at home, but I was trying to find that app you were talking about, the library app. I didn't have. Actually, if you give me your information, maybe I can look at it like that.
Oh man, I totally forgot. Sorry about that. I was gonna look for my library card, but first of all, I don't know where to begin looking. I've not only moved, but I've moved out of the country, moved back to the country, moved out of the country again, moved back to the country again, and then moved again. So my library card has to be here somewhere for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you've been around. I would say you've definitely traveled around for better or worse. I remember. I mean, it's funny. It's funny you say that because I remember you were in Mexico City at the end of 2019, right? And you got back just in time, like within weeks of when COVID hit.
Yeah, actually, one of the very first cases in America was in Washington State at that nursing home. And that's whenever me and Lauren were like, okay, let's just go back on the off chance that, and you know, because in the beginning it was really hard to imagine that it could spread as fast as it did. So we really were just thinking we would go back home. It would be kind of like a fun little visit. And then we would continue moving down into Latin America more. But obviously that didn't happen.
And you got a house.
Did you have any specific questions about this book?
Oh, yeah, there was a wheeling in here for a second. Let's see. I don't know. Like you said, it was the Japanese Stephen King, and you and I are both fans of Stephen King. Did you get any vibes from Stephen King off this book?
Well, yeah, I actually said that to you too soon because the reason I said that, I was at work, and this practically never happens, but there's this coworker who sits behind me. So somehow we both started talking about books, and I was telling him that I like to read Stephen King. I back in the day, I was like really into fantasy, hardcore fantasy. Well,
yeah, you know both.
Exactly. So, but then I started to. Maybe it's just because the fantasy was getting too redundant. Who knows why? But I wanted books set in the real world, and Stephen King not only scratched that itch, but he also gave that little taste of fantasy in his books too. So obviously I like that. I was telling my coworker about that, and he was saying this other author, Haruki Marakami, is essentially the Japanese version of Stephen King, so I should give him a chance. Because his books take place in the real world, and they've got a little bit of fantasy to them. And the first book he recommended I read is this one, Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki. So I said that basically based on what a coworker had told me. It's hard for me to say the same thing, but here's the thing, though. In my opinion, this book had no fantasy elements whatsoever. Now, if you had never read Stephen King, and I told you that Stephen King is a great author, he writes books in the real world, and it's got a little bit of fantasy element to it too. So hey, go and read Mr. Mercedes, right? Mr. Mercedes doesn't have any fantasy in it, so that would have been a terrible example. So I feel like I can't judge that coworker yet, because maybe this book was just a bad example of that formula, and there's other books that fit the formula better, because this book had no fantasy whatsoever. So it's hard to compare him to Stephen King for that reason. Another thing, too, if you want to know the strict difference, and feel free to chime in here if you want to, because I know that you, like me, you've read a ton of Stephen King, but the way Stephen King writes is he's very focused in the moment, and he's very focused on the physical objects and environment around the character, and he's constantly interjecting those things, and that helps the reader paint a greater picture without him having to set the scene. So he doesn't have to say in his paragraph, Mark enters the room, and then spend a page describing the room, and then he moves on to describe what Mark does in the room. He does not do that. As Mark is doing his actions, little tiny details are constantly constantly sprinkled in, right, for Stephen King?
Yeah.
But with Haruki Murakami, it's not nearly as direct. It's much more artistic, and he does flip back and forth between how the character is feeling emotionally and what the character is seeing around them. So there's more depth, but it takes longer for the scene to perform the action that it's trying to take in the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Stephen King, I spent like a year ago, I want to say actually it was 2019, I spent pretty much that entire year reading nothing but like regular, just what I call normal fiction, right? So
yeah.
I read probably about 7 or 8 Stephen King books, one nonfiction, and one thing I can tell you is that he never leaves out detail, and I think one drawback is that sometimes he just rambles.
Yeah,
and
right.
He rambles, and it's like, dude, just get to the point. And I remember reading The Shining, for example, and that's really good. Love the movie, even though it's not really loosely based on the book, but it's still a good movie regardless. And he just rambles on with his different stuff, going over these stories, kind of jump back and forth, and everything has a purpose, I'm sure, but sometimes it just feels like he's just trying to add more words to the page, and he admits that himself in his book on writing. But as far as little details go, I haven't read Colorless, but I'm a big fan of letting I guess you could say, the dialogue and the environment kind of do the explaining for you. You're not saying, for example, you walk into a room and there's a book on the desk, right? You kind of infer it through other ways. You don't have to directly point to everything. You kind of let the reader build that in their head, I guess. It's kind of like I actually just recently read To Kill a Mockingbird, which I know everyone reads in school. Everybody's read it, but I had never read it. Never. and I knew nothing about it, zero. And one thing Harper, yeah, I knew nothing about it. I literally I had it in my house, Taylor's, and I'm like, I've never read this book before, and everyone talks about it, everyone reads it. It was banned. I'm like, okay, let's just read it. And it took me longer than I expected because I wasn't reading as much. But she did that too. She would never actually, a lot of times, not explicitly state detail. Like, for example, there's a part in the book where the neighbor's house burns down. You've read the book, right? Yeah, of course. Everyone's read it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. Of course you have.
Of course I have, man. I went to American high school.
Yeah, so did I. But we never read that. Anyway, there's a part in the book where her house burns down, and then obviously it's being rebuilt, but she never actually explicitly states it's being built. But she has a point, and for some reason it stuck with me. She has a point where she's writing, and Scout, the main character, is talking to her, and instead of mentioning the builders on the house, she mentions having to duck under a plywood that carpenters are carrying. She just implies it through casual just conversation and through something so minor, but you understand when she says that exactly what's happening in the background without having to go through the detail. The sounds, the smell, stuff that I personally, as a writer, probably mistakenly so, probably would have put, the sound of the saw, the sawdust, the smell, things like that, right? Mm-hmm. But all she says was she ducks under some plywood or a 2x4 that they're carrying. And from just that one single statement, you know exactly what's happening without going crazy on the page. And that to me it seems so minor, but that to me was so expert. And I loved it. It actually stuck with me. As wild as that seems, that's the one.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is that's a great way to learn that lesson because you're learning it by seeing it done by an expert. Because one thing that you and I already know is whenever you're writing a book, one of your goals is to write the book and then to go back through the book, go back through your first draft essentially and try to cut out like 50% of the words you wrote. The whole point is to condense it because you're right, like the human imagination is powerful and it doesn't need all that help.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't need any of that. And as a matter of fact, sometimes people, I got a friend of mine, he reads a lot of fantasy. That's all he reads is fantasy. And I've talked about this with you, the category or the genre he reads, the lit RPG type stuff.
Right.
And in that, it's nothing but detail. To a lot of people, to them, good writing, a good book is just a ton of detail. And to me, it's clunky and overloaded. It doesn't need to be there. Even in that genre where it's like based on playing a role-playing game, and you have all these stats and crap. And I've read a little bit of it. It's all right. The book I was reading before was all right, but I stopped reading it because I was reading something else. But actually, I got a question for you. To segue a little bit. Is there anything that you've seen recently in a show or a book, like plot or writing decision, that has made you, I don't know, not like it?
Yeah, actually, your question is going to make me dive into probably what's going to be our final topic for today, since we both like to really hash out things and talk for a while on one thing. And this was something that I was slowly trying to get to.
Hold on one second.
Now you just pushed me over the edge. Okay.
Actually, just keep talking.
Oh, sure. Everything okay? We are building suspense for the listener.
Yeah, that's what you can call it. All right, go.
Okay. So just to rehash it, what is something that I personally have not liked in a story and it has turned me off? All right, well, I'm going to warp that back. I'm going to don't forget that question. That's what's pushing us into this conversation, because what I wanted to talk about, in order to wrap all this in on itself, is the whole Stephen King versus Haruki Murakami writing style. So one thing I was getting at is Stephen King's writing style is very direct. He's going to tell you the details around a character. Slowly, but eventually you're going to see everything that Stephen King thinks is important in that room. And then Haruki Murakami is going to do the opposite. He's going to tell you, he's going to straight up dedicate a paragraph or two to the shit in the room, or the stuff in the room, sorry about that. And then he's going to tell you the emotional significance of it for the main character. So it ends up taking up more space to say the same thing almost. But this is the kicker. Think about both of those writing styles, and then how do they translate to the end of the book? And this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that Stephen King, the way he ends his book, is very final. You are at the final destination, and the story is over, and you know exactly where the main character lands. It's a closed book, in other words. Whereas with Haruki Murakami, what he tends to do, and I'm no expert, right, because I've only read one of his books, but I was talking to my coworker after finishing the book, the Colorless book, and apparently pretty much every Haruki Murakami book ends in a very open way, so that it's almost, the way my coworker describes it is, it's almost like he doesn't want to end the book. He just wants to get it close enough to the end, and then that way the reader can choose their own ending. So,
okay. Yeah, I think you mentioned that. It's kind of abstract.
Yeah, so, like, for me, and I could tell just by the way you responded, not really into that. But there are people who are, apparently, because my coworker loves it. He would prefer not to have an author potentially ruin the end of an otherwise, you just read 500 pages of a book, right? How crushing is it whenever the end of the book is terrible, is awful? So wouldn't it be nice if the author creates this whole story for you, gives you 500 pages of awesome, and then right at the end, it just basically cuts away, and you can make your own ending right there. That's what my coworker thinks. That's his thought process. So my counter question to you, Josh, is which ending style do you prefer, so that I can hear it definitively?
Honestly, I guess it depends. I've had, so in a work of fiction, where you are telling a story where the story is very concrete, where you have a beginning, middle, and end, you have very clear characters, very clear plot, if you want to call it that. I guess it would depend on the degree of abstract you're talking about. I didn't read the book. I have no idea how extreme it is. So, if it's just a little bit, we talked about Inception, for example, how it ends with you don't know for a fact if he's still asleep or not, right?
Right.
So that was okay. It kind of leaves you thinking, but that movie made you think anyway. I didn't really think that was necessary. I didn't mind it, but I prefer in a story like that more concrete. Now, if I'm reading a book that's more nonfiction, I talk about Annie Dillard a lot. She's very abstract in a lot of ways, but also very down to earth. It's kind of hard to explain. She'll end on things, but she leaves you to think about a lot of ideas that she's talking about. So, and I can't think of a book I've read recently that had a kind of ambiguous ending. No, pretty much everything. You've seen
I think it's harder though.
Yeah.
The majority of the stories that I read, they have endings. They in even movies. If we don't want to just talk about books, even movies, they'll have a very clear ending, because what you're talking about with Inception, I feel like Inception was the odd one out. You're not going to have a story that's going to end in such a open way all the time.
Yeah.
And I agree that, like, the premise of Inception was dreams, and was any of this real to begin with? So it made sense for that to end in that way. It still didn't change the fact that it was crushing to not know if he really ever got to see his true kids again. But that was kind of the nature of the beast. It was a movie about dreams.
So, yeah, and I know, like, we watched, I think they were watching Annabelle recently, and, like, at the end of the movie, spoilers, but, you know, basically at the end of the movie, you see, like, the doll will move, like, it's not over yet, you know, basically leading into a sequel. So if it's ambiguous and it's a sequel, that's one thing. But if you're just leaving a book hanging, I know The Sopranos did. I never watched Sopranos. I know the ending was the same way, where it just, like, ends, just cuts off, like, mid-sentence.
Oh my
I'm not
gosh.
really. It does. I'm serious. And I've never watched Sopranos. I've heard it's really good. To me, it just seems if there's a point to it, like if you could explain to me like an artistic value or a purpose for doing that, that's fine. But I feel like a lot of people just don't know how to end it. I'll be honest with you. I think honestly, people just like, we don't know how to end the story. Endings are hard, and it's easier just like, well, I don't know how to end it, so let's just let them decide. It seems it's kind of lazy to me. So I guess at the end of the day, to make this a little bit more simple, is I don't mind it, but I prefer a more concrete ending to a concrete story. But if the book is already abstract, like, okay, like the book Hopscotch, or Rayuela, as it said in Spanish, is a book where you can read it in any single order you want. But that book is not trying to be concrete. It's not trying to be anything more than like kind of a project that he wrote. Julio Cortázar. I don't know. I actually don't know how to say it. And I said I speak Spanish, but maybe I lied. So Cortázar, I think it's like, because of the accent's weird, it's like Cortázar. Anyway, the book jumps around, but it's not like a concrete story. You have to piece it together. It's made like that. But if you're just telling me that the ending is just hangs for no reason other than whatever, then I say it's lazy. But that's just my opinion. I mean, obviously I'm not an expert by any means.
Neither am I, but I can't help but agree with you. And, you know, this book, so the whole book was great. Let me just say that. It really was. And it was so good that I was just slamming down the pages. But at a certain point, and like I said, this author, man, he's telling you everything around the character. He's telling you how he feels about everything around himself. There's all this detail, all this sensory imagery coming to me. So I knew from his writing style, whenever there was still 70 pages left, I was like, there's no way he can finish this book. There's no way he's going to finish this book in 70 pages. After reading over 300 pages of his writing style, you can kind of get a feeling for it. You can get a sense for it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I was so disappointed to find out hours later that I was right. And he did not, in my opinion, did not finish the book. Because, you know, we're talking about spoilers. I could spoil this book. I'm not going to go into super heavy spoilers, but I will just give everyone a sense of what I'm talking about here. So the title of the book is The Character's Name and Colorless. Okay? So here's the reason why. And this part's not a spoiler. This is just told you in the very beginning of the book. He grew up at a high school, and his 4 best friends all had different last names that were a different color. I mean, it's not so weird, right? In America, people have last names of brown, black, green, white. So I mean, it's not an odd idea. So his 4 friends' last names are black, white, red, and blue. And then he is the only one whose last name is not a color. And that's why they all call him Colorless. And they all basically are like super best friends, never want to leave each other. They think basically the whole world is probably scary out there. Let's just be best friends forever. But eventually the time comes whenever they have to graduate. They graduate, and they all decide to go to college in the same hometown except for the main character, colorless, who goes to college in Tokyo. One day he comes back and like none of them want to talk to him anymore. And they basically just tell him, hey, don't ever talk to us again. You know what you did to us. Don't you ever talk to us again. And he has no idea what they're talking about. But from my perspective, what seems like what would happen in like a Japanese anime, he just straight up says, of course, if you don't want me to talk to you, I won't. Like,
okay.
He's basically saying, I have complete respect for you, and because you've told me to never approach you again, that's exactly what I'll do. It's like complete honor, you know? He's showing honor in himself. That's the way I saw it. I was like, from my point of view, if it had been me, I'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We've been best friends for years, and you're suddenly cutting me off for no reason. You got to give me a reason. But no, he didn't do that. So he goes and lives his life, right? But now he's eternally jaded, and he cannot make connections with people. So he has girlfriends, but he ends up either breaking up with them or they break up with him because they feel like he's not connecting. And he lives his whole life like that until he's 36. So he's 36 years old in this book. And basically his current girlfriend tells him, yo, you and I cannot make love anymore. I'm cutting you off because you're just never present. You're never there. I'm basically doing it alone. I think you have trust issues. So he opens up to her about what happened to him in his past. And she's like, the only way that you and I can be together truly is for you to come to terms with what happened to you, for you to find out what happened. Why did they tell you you couldn't be friends with them anymore? So it very quickly becomes a mystery novel where he is tracking down his 4 friends and having a conversation with them to see what he did to wrong them and trying to piece the pieces together. And I'm not going to put any more spoilers than I have to, but for one of the friends, there's this whole big backstory that you never learn the ending of, ever. And then not only that, part of his whole story is because it's not even just those 4 friends or the girlfriends, but other people. They'll tell him, and this is just like throughout his whole life, they talk about it, right? He'll go to meet up with somebody who promised to meet him somewhere, and they won't be there. They just will not show up. So he thinks there's something like defective about him, something that makes it so people are turned away from him, and he is not someone that other people can be sociable with. So at the end of the book, he's going to go meet with his current girlfriend to tell her everything that happened to him, everything he figured out, and he's just on his way to meet her. But that's how it ends. And so you're left as the reader to think, will she even be there? Because that's happened to him so many times throughout the book where he goes to see someone and they completely drop out of his life and he never sees them again. And there's no closure to any of those friendships that he's made or relationships that he's had. It's just, they're gone. And so as a reader, forever now, I will wonder, will his most current girlfriend be at that restaurant waiting for him whenever he arrives? I have no idea.
Yeah, that reminds me of a movie I watched one time, but I mean, obviously it ended, but it's kind of similar in a way. That's interesting, man. Yeah, I don't know. I want to read that now, but I have no access to it currently without just purchasing the book. Yeah, I don't know. That'd kind of annoy me, honestly, if I had to go through this entire book and this man's quest for redemption among his friends and girlfriend, and all of a sudden it's just like, hey, are they going to do it?
And like, on top of that, right, on top of that, as the reader, we're getting pressured into feeling like they need to function as a couple and be a couple for real. Because one of his friends, White, from high school, whenever he meets up with her and talks to her, she's actually really, really happy that Colorless came and found her, and they got to hang out essentially for an afternoon again, like the good old days, right? She's very happy to see him. And she's like, I think your current girlfriend is awesome, and you need to do whatever you can to make that relationship work. And so in the ends of the book, he's remembering that and thinking about that and feeling that and being like, White is right. I need to make sure that this relationship is a blossoming relationship. And so it was just, I honestly, my mouth was hanging open, because on my app, right, it says I've got like, I don't know, let's say 20 pages left. But the last 18 pages aren't even real pages. It's just like the author's foreword and publishing information. So I had no idea I was actually at the end of the book as I was finishing it, and I was like, man, I gotta get to that next chapter. And I moved my finger over, and it's not the next chapter. It's the end of the book. Ugh. How freaking crushing.
Oh, that's awesome, dude. That is awesome. But yeah, I'll have to check that out sometime. Again, I don't like, I guess to wrap this up, I'm not a big fan of this kind of endings, and I think next time we'll talk about something that I've watched.
More
recently.
E3?
Huh? Oh yeah, we'll start off with more E3. We'll talk about how I don't want to talk about E3. We'll talk about that first. But you and I discussed on the phone like a show I watched. It was terrible plot and something we could wrap into, I don't know, connected to something else we're going to talk about. But yeah, man, that's great. I guess that'll be it for today.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much at the end of our amount of time that we want to do.
You know what we should do? We should just like stop the podcast. Let's not even like end it. Just stop.
Oh, dude, that's a great idea. Well, Josh, you got any more topics you want to talk about?